If you draw with a fine liner pen, how carefully do you choose your pen? I don't mean the brand, I'm talking about the nib width. Do you draw with a 0.1 or a 1mm pen? We tend to be creatures of habit and it's easy to pick up the same pen. And I certainly have my favorites and I try and make the best choice for the subject I'm drawing, for the size I'm drawing it, for the detail I have to draw, for the time I have to draw it in, and so forth. But I've often thought, how different would it look if I did the same drawing with different nib sizes? And because I usually use a 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 and a 0.5 in my drawings, I thought, what if I did the same scene, the same size, as close as possible, with each of these pens? So I decided to use one of the 10-minute drawing scenes I used this week as the subject to drawing in 10 minutes the same size with each of those pens, and then afterwards to look at the difference that it had. Now these each took me 10 minutes to draw, but you get to see them in just a minute. Let's have a look at the 4 of them and then we'll compare how they each look and just have a moment's reflection on what's the impact been of changing pens. And we'll start with the 0.1mm pen. But before I start, let me just show you a little technique that I'm using for this video to help make sure that my 4 drawings are all the same scale. I don't want them to become larger or smaller than each other because the way we perceive the impact of line work is partly determined by the size, by the scale of the overall drawing. And I want that to stay the same across the 4 pen widths. So what I've done is, with my reference, I've got a scrap of paper and I've marked for me what I regard as a number of key reference points for the heights. And so before I start drawing on each sheet of paper, you'll probably notice I have a series of dots. And that's to help with my alignment of the heights. And so the most important one is these two because they're the height of this column, which is my starting point in each of the scenes. And so that lets me start my most important reference point, knowing that in each of the drawings, it's exactly the same height. And if I scale accurately from that, my drawings should all approximately be the same size, but particularly bearing in mind that I want the top of my dome to be here and that this is the same base point that I'm drawing in each of my diagrams. So when you see these points, that's why they're there, that's how I'm using them. But this isn't something that I would normally use in any of my drawings. It's simply to make sure that my 4 identical drawings are as close as possible in size to each other for the sake of the comparison at the end. So these 4 drawings you're watching at approximately 10 times my actual drawing speed. This is a subject I'd used for one of my real-time 10-minute daily drawing exercises. So if you want to watch me draw it in real time, you can go back to see the first time I drew this. I was hoping that that would also give me some familiarity with the drawing process and this subject in general and the observation and all the experience that we build up the first time we do a drawing. Now, I don't normally do a whole drawing with a 0.1mm pen. I normally use it for finer details that I draw quite lightly, and particularly when I do distance scenes in drawings to help create the effect of far away. But this time, it's for the whole drawing. And there we have it. And while I'm looking for my 0.2mm pen for the next drawing, let me say that in making this video, as well as hopefully teaching something that's of value to you, I actually learnt something that was of great value to me. A very unexpected lesson, in fact, from my 4 drawings. It's got nothing to do with the pen width. It wasn't an intentional outcome of this, but it's something that I learned at the end when I looked at my drawings and realized I'd made a fundamental mistake, then worked out why so I could try and make sure I don't fall into it again. and I thought it might be for you an interesting insight into my learning process. So I've put all that at the end, so make sure you don't miss that. It might well be the most interesting and helpful part of the whole video. But for now, let's get back to the 0.2 millimeter drawing. Now, 0.2 millimeters is a width that I quite often use for a whole drawing. And I must admit, I was quite surprised how similar the 0.1 and 0.2 millimeter drawings looked. A hindsight thought to this video is that it would have possibly been better to have had 4 brand new pens for each of these 4 drawings, so that any variation of ink flow and supply or wear and tear on the nib would have been avoided. However, it is what it is for now. So I'll just quickly finish my 0.2 millimeter drawing, and then I'll have a look around for my 0.3 millimeter pen. .3 is probably my most common line width that I use in my drawing. I find it's a nice compromise between dark enough to have some impact but fine enough to create a fair bit of detail if need be, especially if I apply less pressure, use a lighter touch, or vice versa. There's a fair bit of versatility in this, but it's dark enough too where if I need to do some hatching and cross-hatching to create dark values, it's not too onerous a job to put that many lines there. It's not as much effort as for a 0.2 millimeter pen, I find. So we're just doing the finishing touches, top and bottom, to this tower drum, and there we have it. And finally, number 4. Using a 0.5 millimeter pen. Now, I very seldom do a whole drawing in a 0.5 millimeter pen, and that's possibly partly because my drawings are all relatively small these days, because mostly they're for videoing for a YouTube video, and therefore I can't afford for them to be too large for all sorts of reasons. But where I most use them are in drawings which are more scenes that go back a long way, that have a lot of depth in them, and I use them for the foreground, for the closest elements, to get them looking nice and dark. And it's particularly helpful if I have shadows or dark values in the foreground as well, because I can achieve them with a lot less work, a lot fewer lines, in a lot less time. And that's always appreciated. So here's our final drawing. Let's compare them. Here we have our 4 drawings, the 0.1, the 0.2, the 0.3, and the 0.5. And the obvious thing, particularly looking at them together and from a little further back, is that the heavier lines, the wider lines, do have a blacker feel, and they almost have a more detailed feel. It's almost as if there's more drawn here than is drawn here, even though in fact the line work is almost identical. I think the thing that I was most surprised about was how the 2 heavier lined towers became wider than the finer line ones. And I can easily compare the widths this way. So 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and then 0.4 is really between the 2. Now you remember I used the dots to ensure the proportions vertically were all the same. And then it occurred to me in my drawing, when I drew this and was comparing this one to this one, I thought, oh no, I've gone too wide. And so I tried to deliberately pull back in the width with this thicker pen. Now, I was trying to draw it as thin as this here because I felt that those proportions were the best. And I think what this does show is that when we have a thicker line and we have a lot of lines to place, either vertically or horizontally, the very thickness of the pen line can encourage us to push our spaces wider because in many ways we're trying to create the same amount of white paper between the lines. But when my lines are thicker, the actual width line over repeated vertical lines starts to push the whole total width further apart. In fact, if we draw with a heavier pen, we need to compromise the amount, if you like, of white being shown and make it slightly narrower so that the width of the line doesn't accumulate and become too much of an overall widening effect. But then it did occur to me, I can check the width of the tower this way in my reference. And much to my surprise, in fact, all of my towers are too narrow.
Maybe you've noticed this, but it took me by surprise.
In fact, my widest is the most accurate.
And if you're finding this interesting, why not hit the like button right now for me? Thanks.
I keep hammering the fact of careful observation is so important, and I obviously need to listen to that myself. But I ask myself, why did I get it wrong?
Because this is part of our what should be normal process of critiquing what we've done and asking why has something worked or not worked the way we expected it to. And I think it's partly
the effect of having this section not in my drawing, but in my reference. When I looked at this, it was easy to see this overall shape as the one I was trying to draw here. And I think visually I was misled by that. So there's a point that may be helpful. That other shapes around the shape or inside the shape that we're drawing can distort our perception of the actual proportions of what we are drawing. And sometimes it can be helpful to isolate in our reference what we're actually drawing to get a better sense of it. And now that I do this, and this is the first time I've done this top and bottom, I'm amazed how much I misread the proportions.
And I show you all this for a couple of reasons. The first is that you realize that we're all on a drawing journey and we all continue to learn, that I certainly haven't reached any endpoint myself. But secondly, this is how I learn. I'm letting you in on the actual process I have of I observe things that aren't right, I ask why, I try to understand it so that I can either just simply be aware of it or even work out strategies of overcoming it in my next drawing. My mistakes give me a focus in some way for my future strategies and drawings. This is the pattern I do repeatedly with all of my drawings. I never just say, oh, this looks wonderful. I say, what have I done? How have I done it? Why have I done it? And what should I do in the future? It's an ongoing process. And I have found it's an extraordinarily helpful one in pushing my drawing development and in my mind improvement onwards.
Look, I hope you found this little exercise in comparative drawing and varying the ink widths interesting. And if you're finding this interesting, please, why not hit the like button right now for me? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I found this process really interesting, but more than that, very helpful in helping me to see how I still, after all this time, need to pay more attention in my observation and into isolating more carefully individual proportions of various components of my scene when I draw them.
And not to presume so much what I think I've seen, and particularly not to do it over and over again for the same drawing.
But look, whatever we draw, however we're drawing it, whatever pen we use, we need to make sure we have fun. I'll see you next video. Bye.